I was already late for the biggest interview of my life when I saw her. This tiny girl, sitting alone on a stone bench, crying into her hands while the whole street walked past. Her voice shook when she said she couldn't find her way home. I knew if I stopped, I'd blow my only shot, but I couldn't make my legs keep moving. The morning sun had already climbed high enough to cast a pale glare across the kitchen window when David Harper checked the clock for the third time. 9:15 a.m. His pulse jumped. He was late. He stood in front of the hallway mirror, tugging once more at the sleeves of his freshly pressed shirt. It was the only dress shirt he owned without frayed cuffs. The collar felt stiff against his neck, the faint starch smell clinging to it like a reminder of the stakes. In his hands, calloused from years of hauling boxes, scrubbing pots, and tightening bolts, his resume trembled, not from the cool air but from the thin current of adrenaline running through him. This wasn't just another interview. This was the interview, the one that might pull him out of the cycle of low-paying, unstable work. After years of dishwashing in the back corners of noisy restaurants, doing overnight security shifts in drafty warehouses, even scavenging scrap metal when things were desperate, here it was, a logistics firm downtown offering full-time benefits, a reliable salary, and the kind of stability that could finally make him breathe a little easier. More than that, it could pay for his daughter Gracie's asthma medication without him choosing between that and groceries. It could mean she'd wake up on her birthday to more than a homemade cake and a secondhand book. He could finally afford a couple of balloons and maybe, just maybe, that bicycle she'd been eyeing in the thrift store window. David slung his old leather briefcase over his shoulder. It wasn't pretty. One of the straps was mended with electrical tape, but it was sturdy, like him. He took a deep breath at the doorway, closing his eyes for just a second to steady the racing of his thoughts. This is it, he told himself silently. No mistakes today. The city's morning rush greeted him the moment he stepped outside. The metallic hiss of bus doors, the impatient blare of horns, the endless tide of shoes against concrete. David broke into a jog, weaving through pedestrians with the controlled urgency of a man who knew time was already slipping through his fingers. His briefcase thumped rhythmically against his leg as he passed storefronts, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery mixing with the sharp bite of exhaust from passing cars. Every step carried the weight of years spent clawing for a break that never seemed to come. If he could just make it on time, just get in that chair across from the hiring manager, maybe things would finally start to turn. But fate, he was about to discover, had a way of showing up uninvited and rearranging everything you thought you knew about what mattered most. Elm Street was only 3 blocks from the glass and steel tower where his interview was scheduled. David kept his eyes on the crosswalk signal, willing it to change faster, his breath puffing in short bursts from the combination of nerves and running. He was already calculating how many minutes he could shave off if he took the next alley, when a sound stopped him mid-stride. A small, uneven sob drifted over the hum of traffic. Not loud, but raw enough to slice through the noise. David slowed. Ahead, on the edge of a stone bench beneath a thin strip of morning shade, sat a little girl no older than 6. Her knees were pulled up, her shoulders trembling under a pale cardigan. She had her face buried in her hands, and the soft shake of her body told him these weren't the quick, attention-seeking cries of a bored child. This was fear, the kind that hollows out your chest. People passed her without even glancing. A woman balancing a coffee and a phone, a man in a tailored suit too busy rehearsing something in his head. David stood still for a heartbeat, his mind split cleanly in two. The interview, David. You're already late. Keep moving. But another voice, quieter yet heavier, pressed against that thought. What if this was Gracie? Alone, scared, waiting for someone to care? He stepped forward slowly, not wanting to startle her. Hey, he said gently, crouching down so he was level with her. Are you okay? Are you lost? The girl's head lifted. Wide eyes glistened under the trace of tears on her cheeks. Her voice came out in a trembling rush. I don't know where my driver is. I was supposed to be picked up after piano class, but no one came. David blinked. She wasn't dressed like most kids he saw at the bus stop. Her shoes looked like something out of a department store catalog, polished to a shine, and a pearl headband held back hair so neatly brushed it looked like it had been done that morning by careful hands. The backpack resting at her side probably cost more than his monthly rent. I was trying to walk home, she went on, her lip quivering. but then I got scared. He hesitated, the weight of choice pressing into his chest. He pictured the conference table he was supposed to be sitting at in less than 10 minutes, the interviewer's watchful eyes, the steady paycheck that could follow. But then the image was pushed aside by another. Gracie at 6, clutching her worn teddy bear, scanning a strange street for a familiar face that never came. David straightened slightly, extending his hand toward her. "It's all right," he said softly, steadying his voice. "I'll help you get home. We'll figure this out together." She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to trust the man in the slightly rumpled shirt and scuffed shoes. Then she nodded. "Okay." They began walking side by side, her small fingers curling instinctively around his. The briefcase at his hip bumped with every step, a physical reminder of the opportunity he was walking away from. And yet, with each block, that choice felt less like a loss and more like something he was meant to do. They moved through the busy sidewalks together, his stride unconsciously shortening to match hers. The girl clung to his hand, her fingers surprisingly warm against his calloused skin. David adjusted his pace so she wouldn't have to rush, scanning the street signs at every corner. "What's your name?" he asked, glancing down at her. "Ellie," she said, still watching the ground as if unsure it would stay steady beneath her feet. "Well, Ellie, I'm David," he replied, his tone light but steady. "Do you know your address?" She nodded quickly and recited it without hesitation, a long street name in a neighborhood David only knew from real estate flyers, the kind he would toss aside with a wry smile, knowing the prices were galaxies beyond his reach. "That's a good ways from here," he said, calculating the distance in his head. "We'll walk together until we get close. If we need to, I'll help you call someone." Ellie gave a small nod, but her hand stayed wrapped around his like a lifeline. The city noise swelled and faded as they passed storefronts, a laundromat with dryers humming, a deli already filling with the smell of pastrami, a florist misting rows of roses. A delivery truck idled nearby, its engine growling in contrast to the soft tap of Ellie's patent leather shoes on the pavement. David noticed how she kept glancing at each passing car, her brow furrowing when she didn't recognize them. He remembered the first time he had to leave Gracie with a neighbor while working a double shift, how even hours later, the image of her small face pressed against the window had gnawed at him. "Were you walking long before I found you?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "A little. I thought I could find my way, but the buildings all look the same here." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she squeezed his hand tighter. He gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Happens to a lot of people in the city. You're doing great." By the 8th block, the scenery began to shift. The cracked sidewalks smoothed out, litter thinned, and the storefronts were replaced by quiet rows of manicured hedges. Expensive sedans sat in driveways behind short brick walls. David knew without asking that they were getting close. The last few minutes passed in silence, the morning sun warming their backs. When they turned onto her street, his steps slowed in spite of himself. The house looming at the end of the block looked less like a home and more like something out of a magazine, gated, with marble steps that gleamed even in the soft light. He had expected something nice, but this was wealth in another language entirely. Ellie's small hand twitched in his, and he realized she was no longer just relieved. She was running toward the gate. The moment they reached the tall wrought iron gate, it swung open with a metallic groan. A woman in a dark uniform, apron crisp, hair pinned into a tight bun, hurried down the marble steps as if her shoes barely touched them. "Miss Ellie," she gasped, her voice breaking between relief and disbelief. She dropped to her knees the instant she reached the little girl, wrapping her arms around her with a tenderness that was almost desperate. "Oh, thank heavens. We've been searching everywhere." Ellie buried her face into the maid's shoulder for a moment before glancing back toward David. "He helped me get home," she said softly. David stood just inside the gate, awkwardly shifting the weight of his briefcase from one hand to the other. The cool scent of roses drifted through the air from somewhere in the sprawling garden, mingling with the faint lemon polish smell wafting from the open door. Everything about the place, the sheer size of the entryway, the gleam of those steps, felt foreign to him. He had spent most of his life in small apartments where the front door opened straight into the living room. Here, the hallway alone looked larger than his entire home. The maid rose quickly, guiding Ellie toward the open door. Come inside. Miss Ellie, quickly, she urged, glancing once at David with a cautious, appraising look. Not unfriendly, but clearly uncertain. Inside, the space was bright and vast, sunlight spilling in through tall windows and reflecting off polished floors. The air was cool, almost unnaturally so, as if the temperature inside obeyed a different set of rules than the August heat pressing against the city. David lingered near the doorway, feeling out of place in his sweat-soaked shirt and worn shoes. He could hear hurried footsteps echoing from deeper in the house, then the sharp, rapid clicks of heels on tile. A woman appeared at the far end of the hallway. She moved with purpose, her white suit tailored perfectly, her dark hair sleek against the curve of her jaw. Her makeup was flawless, not a smudge, not a single hair out of place, yet her eyes betrayed panic. "Ellie," she cried, her voice shaking as she closed the distance and dropped to her knees beside her daughter. "What happened? Where were you?" Ellie turned slightly and pointed toward David. "He helped me, Mommy. He didn't leave me alone." For the first time, the woman's eyes met his. She seemed to take him in all at once. The sweat on his brow, the faint crease in his shirt from rushing, the scuffed tips of his shoes, and then her gaze settled on his face. "You brought my daughter home," she said, the words measured but heavy with meaning. David cleared his throat, unsure if his voice would come out steady. "She was crying. I couldn't just leave her. I missed an important meeting, but it was worth it." The woman rose gracefully from her kneeling position, still keeping one hand on Ellie's shoulder as if to reassure herself that the girl was truly there. She studied David more closely now, not just as a stranger who had appeared with her child, but as a man standing in her front hall, visibly worn from the heat, from the rush, from life. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly, the question sharp enough to catch him off guard. David nodded once. "A daughter. Gracie. She's 10. The moment he said her name, a flicker of warmth passed over his features, the kind that came from picturing her gap-toothed smile and the way she curled up in the corner of their couch with a book. "What's your work?" she continued, her gaze unwavering. He shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other. "I'm looking," he admitted, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "Been trying hard. Today was my best shot in months." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing his words against the sincerity she heard in them. Then she straightened fully. "Wait here," she said, and before he could respond, she disappeared down a hallway lined with framed art and soft light. David stood in silence. The cool marble beneath his shoes felt miles away from the hot pavement he'd walked earlier. His mind drifted briefly to the interview, the seat that was probably already filled by someone else, the manager glancing at a clock before moving on to the next name on the list. A quiet pang of loss tightened in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Ellie was safe. That had to be enough. Minutes ticked by. 5. Then 10. David considered whether he should leave, but just as he shifted his weight toward the door, the sound of heels returned. The woman reappeared, holding a single white business card between two manicured fingers. "I'm Vanessa Aldridge," she said. David blinked. The name tugged at his memory until it landed with a thud. "Aldridge Logistics?" She smiled faintly. "That's right. I was on my way to interview for a junior logistics coordinator position there," he said, stunned. Vanessa's eyes softened. "Well, Mr. Harper, consider this your final interview. And congratulations, you passed with flying colors." A laugh escaped him, short and disbelieving. "But I missed it." "You didn't," she replied gently. "You showed me who you are without a desk, without a script. That's the kind of man I want on my team." For a moment, David couldn't find words. The weight of weeks, no, years, of uncertainty seemed to loosen its grip on his shoulders. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes pricking with heat. Vanessa glanced down at her daughter, her expression softening in a way that contrasted sharply with the composed businesswoman David had just met. "Ellie," she said quietly, "would you like to say something?" Ellie looked up at her mother, then at David. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. David froze for a moment, surprised, then rested a careful hand on her shoulder. She pressed her cheek into his shirt, her voice muffled but clear enough to cut straight through him. "Thank you for not leaving me," she whispered. David's voice caught before he could respond. Any real dad would have done the same. It came out rougher than he intended, but it was the truth. Vanessa's gaze lingered on him, as though weighing the meaning in his words. Not every man would have stopped, she said softly. Most just walked past. David didn't have an answer for that. His eyes shifted briefly to Ellie, still holding on to him like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. He thought of Gracie, how she hugged him in much the same way after a nightmare. How that simple act always reminded him that being present was the most important job he had. Ellie finally stepped back, but her hand brushed against his one last time before she retreated to her mother's side. Something passed between the three of them in that moment. Unspoken, but undeniable. That evening, David stood outside his apartment door with a paper grocery bag balanced on one arm and a small bouquet of daisies tucked carefully under the other. The weight of the day still clung to him, but it was a different kind of heaviness, one filled with relief, disbelief, and a fragile excitement he hadn't felt in years. When he stepped inside, the familiar scent of their home greeted him, a mixture of laundry soap, pencil shavings from Gracie's desk, and the faint trace of the dinner she'd tried to make the night before. "Dad," her voice floated from the kitchen, followed by the quick patter of bare feet on the worn linoleum. She appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly messy, a smudge of graphite on her cheek from whatever she'd been drawing. He set the groceries on the counter, then crouched to her level. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his grin stretching wide despite the lump forming in his throat. "I've got news." Gracie's eyes flicked to the flowers, then back to him, suspicion and hope mingling in her expression. "Good news." "The best," he said, and before she could ask, he scooped her up, spinning her in a wide circle until she laughed so hard she had to clutch at his shoulders. "We made it, baby. We finally made it." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "You got the job?" "I got the job," he confirmed, still almost not believing it himself. The rest came tumbling out between laughter and a few tears. How he'd met Ellie, how she'd been lost, how her mom turned out to be his would-be boss. Gracie listened with wide eyes, nodding at all the right places, her fingers playing absently with the edge of his shirt. By the time he finished, the groceries were still unpacked and the daisies still sat in his hand. He placed them in an old mason jar on the table, the bright yellow petals standing out against the dim kitchen light. From that day forward, David's life shifted in ways he could never have planned. He wasn't just a junior logistics coordinator anymore. He was part of something bigger. The Aldridges welcomed him and Gracie as if they'd always belonged. Ellie and Gracie became fast friends, spending afternoons sprawled on the floor with coloring books or chasing each other through the park. Most importantly, David never again had to choose between being there for his daughter and keeping food on the table. One act of kindness, made in a split second on a busy street, had led him to everything he never dared to dream of.